You can almost hear it, the dull, hollow creak of wooden shutters tightening against the wind. Winter in medieval Europe wasn't simply a season. It was a reckoning. From the rocky shores of Scotland to the forests of Poland, the medieval cold shaped not just daily life, but the very rhythm of survival. When the first frost touched the grass, every villager knew what it meant the long dark was coming, and with it hunger, sickness, and stillness. You might imagine the Middle Ages as full of knights and battles, but most people's greatest enemy wasn't a sword, it was the chill. The rhythm of the year in medieval life, the calendar was tied to survival. Spring meant planting, summer meant mending, autumn meant storing, but winter was waiting. By late September, the harvest would be drawn in, grains threshed and stored in wooden bins, apples packed in straw, and root vegetables buried in earthen pits. Every house became a fortress against scarcity. Families inspected thatch roofs, patched leaks with mud and straw, and thickened the wattle walls with dung. A surprisingly effective, if pungent, insulator. There were no thermostats, no quick fires. Warmth depended on planning, and planning began months before the snow. In a small English village around 1320, a family might gather around the last of the autumn daylight, taking stock how many sacks of barley, how much smoked pork hung from the rafters. Was there enough straw to fill the bedding for the animals and themselves? The animals, after all, were heat. Living, breathing insulation in the barn beside the house. The warmth of oxen and pigs might mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. Houses of timber and smoke, the average medieval peasant house was a simple affair: timber frame, clay walls, thatched roof. A single room, no chimney, no glass windows, just an open hearth in the center, where the fire burned day and night. The smoke rose freely through a hole in the roof, or simply lingered inside until it found a way out. The result was a constant haze, eyes watering, lungs thick with soot. But that smoke was essential. It dried the meat, preserved the wood, and kept insects at bay. You might find it unpleasant, but to them, it was the smell of survival. At night, the family slept together, often sharing straw mattresses on the floor. The youngest nestled closest to the fire, the elders on the outer edge. The animals in the adjoining pen could be heard breathing, a reminder that life continued however cold it grew. The daily struggle for heat, firewood, was precious. By January, supplies ran low. In parts of northern France, villagers had already stripped the surrounding woodlands bare centuries earlier. Woodcutting was regulated. Even gathering fallen branches could be punishable by fine. Poorer families relied on peat, cut from the marshes, dried in summer, and stacked like dark bricks near the house. The smell of burning peat was heavy, earthy, and constant. It clung to hair, clothing, and breath. Still, it burned longer than wood, and for many it was all they had. Those who could not gather enough fuel turned to dried dung. Animal waste pressed into patties and left to harden in the sun. It produced little flame, but enough warmth to keep frost from forming on the walls. In monasteries, where discipline ruled every hour, warmth was rationed too. Monks gathered in unheated stone halls, chanting prayers with breath steaming in the air. Only the infirmary and the scriptorium, where precious manuscripts were copied, were allowed fires in some orders. The rule of Saint Benedict was clear comfort tempted weakness. Food in the frozen months: if you lived through a medieval winter, you ate what you had, and what you could preserve. Grain was life. Pottage, a thick stew of barley, peas, onions, and whatever scraps remained, simmered endlessly in the pot, day after day. Each morning it was reheated. Each evening a little more water was added. It was both meal and measure of endurance. Bread was coarse and dark, made from rye or barley. Wheat was a luxury. By February, when stores thinned, loaves grew smaller and mixtures rougher. Bark acorns, or ground beans, stretched the flour. People spoke of lean Lent, not as a religious season, but as a simple fact: food ran out, and faith filled the gaps. Salt was precious, not for flavor, but for survival. It preserved meat through the long months. A barrel of salted pork might sustain a family if kept dry. If it spoiled, there was little to replace it. In the far north, dried fish and smoked herring lined the rafters, their scent mingling with the peat smoke. Even the poorest peasant knew the worth of a salted herring. The cold's toll on the body, winter illnesses thrived. There was no understanding of germs, only the belief in humors. That cold, wet air corrupted the body's balance. Physicians recommended warm wine spiced with cloves or cinnamon, but such luxuries were distant dreams for most. The peasant's remedy was heat, a fire if possible, or a thick blanket of straw if not. Frostbite was common, so were respiratory ailments. The cold and smoke worked together to shorten lives. In some regions, mortality in winter months was double that of summer. Yet people adapted. They learned when to rest, when to gather, when to simply endure. In cities, where thousands crowded into narrow, smoky dwellings, winter meant stillness. Trade slowed, markets froze, and streets turned to ice. The night watch carried torches not just for safety but to prevent freezing in the wind. Bells still tolled, marking hours few could afford to count. Community in the dark still. The season wasn't entirely bleak. Winter was also a time of gathering, a forced companionship. In small villages, people drew closer, work paused. Repairs, weaving, mending, all were done by firelight. Tales were told, prayers shared. Even amid hunger, there was rhythm, comfort in routine. Feast days punctuated the darkness. Candlemas, Epiphany setting, Brigid's Day, small reminders that life continued, that the world would warm again. The church calendar gave meaning to endurance. And in those moments, humanity showed itself most plainly. The shared loaf, the borrowed coal, the neighbor's gesture, acts of survival as much as faith. The Great Freeze, there were winters that surpassed memory. Chronicles tell of rivers frozen so thick that carts crossed upon them, of vineyards turned to wasteland and flocks dead by the thousand. The winter of 1315, at the start of the Great Famine, lingered like a curse. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow, and snow to endless grey skies. Harvests rotted and grain prices tripled. By spring, people boiled bark for soup and stripped the skins of dead animals. It wasn't cruelty, it was the logic of hunger. The monks who kept the records wrote that even the birds fell from the sky, but more often, they noted smaller things: the cost of salt, the number of loaves baked, the lateness of thaw. History remembers kings and wars, but the true battle was fought in silence, against the cold. Waiting for the thaw by March, the first signs of hope appeared. Icicles melted from the eaves, mud replaced ice, the fields, bare and grey, waited for seed again. People emerged like ghosts, thin and pale, ready to work. Surviving a medieval winter was not heroic, it was ordinary. It was what one did, year after year. There was no expectation of comfort, only of endurance. And yet, every time the sun returned, there was a kind of quiet joy. Not exuberant, but deep. The thaw was a promise that the world had not ended, that the cycle continued. Still, as one year faded into another, people must have wondered, how long could this continue? Each winter seemed colder, the harvest shorter. Some spoke of punishment, others of a shifting world. Was it just their imagination, or was Europe truly growing colder? When you open the pages of a medieval chronicle, the words often sound distant. Kings crowned, battles fought, saints martyred. But hidden between those grand events are quieter notes. The river froze. The vines bore no fruit. The sea ice lasted until Easter. Those small details tell a greater story, a story of the world growing colder, and the people who learned to live within that slow, creeping chill. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, Europe experienced what we now call the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling that reshaped every corner of life. The cause was complex: of volcanic eruptions, shifts in solar activity, ocean currents. But to those living through it, it wasn't science, it was fate. A slow, relentless change. You wouldn't have noticed it in a single year. Winters were always hard, harvests sometimes failed. But by the early 1300s, the patterns shifted. Spring came later, frosts lingered longer. The summers, when they arrived, were wetter, and the growing season shortened. Wheat struggled in northern soils, vineyards vanished from England, even in France, wine turned sour. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was relentless. Every few years brought another bad harvest, another flood, another winter that refused to end. And as the seasons faltered, so did certainty. In villages, people noticed first through hunger. In towns, through rising prices. In monasteries, through the ink of chroniclers who wrote in wary script. The people are starving. The sky gives no warmth. The Great Famine of 1317, the first great disaster of this cooling world, came swiftly. In the spring of 1315, the rains began, and did not stop. They washed out fields, drowned seed, and turned roads to rivers. Crops failed across northern Europe, from Ireland to Poland. By autumn, the grain bins were empty, and prices soared beyond reach. The following winter froze the ground solid, livestock starved, and desperate peasants ate the seed they were meant to plant. The chronicles speak of horror, children abandoned, old people left behind, even whispered tales of cannibalism. For 2 years, the continent shivered and starved. When the rains finally ceased, perhaps 1 in 10 people had perished. It wasn't just famine. It was the breaking of an illusion, the belief that the world's seasons could be trusted, and in its place came something else: faith, fear, and the long search for meaning in the cold. the theology of weather to the medieval mind. Weather was not random, it was moral. The climate was a reflection of sin, virtue, or divine favor. When the winters grew longer, priests preached repentance. Processions filled the streets, prayers were chanted, relics carried through frozen fields. The faithful begged for warmth, for mercy, for the sun to return. Some blamed the Jews, others witches, others still the hidden corruption of society. Droughts and floods alike were signs of God's anger, of his testing, of his withdrawal. The church itself adapted. Certain saints became popular protectors against the cold. Medard for rain, Saint Blaise for throats chilled by winter cough, Saint Martin for warmth and charity. Candlemas, celebrated in early February, took on new significance as a beacon of returning light. But beneath the prayers was a harder truth: belief didn't make the crops grow. Faith gave hope, but not food. Agriculture in the frozen age before the Little Ice Age, Europe had thrived under what historians call the medieval warm period. Fields were fertile, populations grew, trade flourished. But when the climate shifted, those gains unraveled. In the north, farmers abandoned marginal lands. High hills, shallow soils, and mountain pastures no longer yielded crops. Whole villages vanished, swallowed by forest or reclaimed by bog. Grain, once plentiful, became unreliable. People turned to rye and oats, hardier but less nutritious. Barley replaced wheat, and turnips replaced greens. Bread darkened again. To conserve fertility, fallow years lengthened. Some regions adopted the three-field system, rotating crops more carefully. In others, soil simply wore out. By the 15th century, even lords struggled to collect rents. Many tenants left. The manorial economy, the foundation of feudal Europe, began to crack under the weight of climate. It wasn't revolution that weakened feudalism. It was frost, hunger and innovation, yet out of desperation came small, practical miracles. Windmills multiplied, especially in lowland regions of the Netherlands and Germany, turning gusts into grinding power when rivers froze. Watermills were rebuilt with stronger wheels to handle floods. The humble plough evolved, fitted with heavier iron to break cold, wet soil. In the north, people learned new ways to preserve food: smoked fish, dried peas, salted meat. These were the technologies of endurance. Even cheese changed. Harder varieties like cheddar or parmesan could last the winter, traveling across trade routes that carried survival itself. In the Baltic, the Hanseatic League, a network of merchants bound by necessity, thrived on this trade of preservation. Salt from Öneberg, herring from Scandinavia, grain from Prussia. Cold, ironically, made commerce stronger. You can almost picture it: frozen harbors, sails stiff with ice, merchants counting barrels by torchlight, all for the simple aim of not starving. Clothing the cold, daily life adjusted to, layer by layer. Wool became the universal armor of survival. The spinning wheel spread across Europe during these centuries, turning fleece into thread faster than ever before. Weavers produced thick cloaks, hose, and caps lined with fur. Linen was layered beneath wool to trap heat. In cities, tailors developed fitted garments, not for style, but for insulation. Gloves and hoods became essential. Even boots were stuffed with straw for warmth. Wealth, as always, brought comfort. Nobles wore sable and ermine, peasants wore sheepskin turned inside out. But the principle was the same: the cold demanded covering. In art from this period, the paintings of Bruegel, for example, winter isn't a backdrop, it's the stage. You can see villagers huddled around fires, skaters on frozen ponds, breath visible in the air. It's a frozen world made human through endurance. The cities freeze. Urban life in the cold centuries became a different sort of challenge. Stone walls held the chill, streets turned to mud and ice. The poor huddled in cellars or under bridges, burning anything they could find: refuse, old shoes, even furniture. City councils began issuing winter ordinances: limits on firewood prices, rules for chimney maintenance, penalties for blocking roads with snow. Public baths, once common, declined, partly because of the cold, partly for moral reasons. Cleanliness, like warmth, became a luxury. But even as hardship deepened, life continued. Guilds held their feasts. Churches kept their rituals. Markets adapted, selling dried goods instead of fresh, candles instead of flowers. The medieval city did not stop, it simply moved slower, under the grey sky. The frozen rivers, one of the strangest, most beautiful consequences of the Little Ice Age, was the freezing of Europe's great rivers. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, the Rhine in Cologne, all froze solid at times. When that happened, the people turned adversity into celebration. By the 15th century, frost fairs became a custom. Stalls were built directly on the ice. Vendors sold roasted nutzel and gingerbread. Blacksmiths set up anvils, printers sold commemorative pamphlets. Children skated on bone skates. carved from animal shen bones, strapped to boots with leather thongs. It was both strange and festive, the hardship of winter transformed into spectacle. The frozen world became a marketplace, yet beneath the laughter everyone knew it was a fragile joy. When the ice broke, as it inevitably did, stalls, people, and hopes vanished with it. The cold across continents, the Little Ice Age wasn't just European. Across the globe, patterns shifted. In China, harvest failures weakened dynasties. In the Americas, droughts alternated with floods. But in Europe, where records were carefully kept, we can see the human cost most clearly. Populations shrank. Wars worsened by famine raged longer. The Black Death, arriving in 1347, found a world already weakened by hunger. Was it the cold that made the plague so devastating? Perhaps not directly. But when bodies are thin and immune systems fragile, disease travels faster. The chill had softened humanity's defenses long before the rats came ashore. Faith, doubt, and the weathered soul. As the centuries passed, people adapted not only their lives, but their beliefs. The idea that weather reflected morality began to waver. Scientists, or what passed for them, started observing patterns, measuring rainfall, keeping temperature notes. Theologians debated whether God truly punished through frost. In monasteries, some monks quietly recorded daily temperatures alongside prayers, creating the first proto-climatological records. They didn't call it science, they called it vigilance. Still, for most, faith remained the surest warmth. The church walls glowed with candlelight on the darkest nights. Pilgrimages continued even through snow. The rhythm of bells persisted through centuries of cold. It was, in a sense, humanity's greatest triumph, the ability to endure the inexplicable with ritual, to find order in chaos. The gradual thaw of time. By the 17th century, Europe had learned to live with the cold. Architecture evolved, smaller windows, thicker walls. Trade routes shifted to accommodate frozen seas. Diets grew heartier, richer in fats and preserved foods. But the winters remained cruel. Even in the age of Shakespeare, the Thames still froze. Artists painted their world not as lush and green, but blue and brittle. And through it all, people continued the quiet work of survival, mending, praying, hoping, enduring. When you think of the Middle Ages, perhaps you imagine knights or kings. But history's true continuity came from those who faced the cold, who watched the frost creep through the window gaps and still rose to light the fire again. Theirs was not heroism in battle, but in patience. A patience stretched across centuries, against a world that seemed to be freezing over. And yet the question lingered, whispered in every generation. Was this chill the end of the world, or just another season in God's long plan? Imagine standing at the edge of a thawing river in the early 18th century. The air is still cold, but softer now. The frost that once sealed the Thames is melting, breaking apart with sharp, echoing cracks. Wooden stalls that only weeks ago sold roasted chestnuts and cider on the ice now sink and vanish into the grey current. The people cheer, not because the fair is ending, but because the thaw has come. For generations, Europe had lived beneath the slow hand of winter. But by the dawn of the modern era, something had begun to shift. It wasn't sudden, winters still came and some were still cruel. Yet, for the first time in centuries, spring began to return with more reliability. The Little Ice Age, though it would linger into the 1800s, had begun to loosen its grip. The memory of cold, however, would never leave. The slow warming of a continent. Climatologists today speak of cycles, of volcanic quiescence, of solar patterns returning to equilibrium. But for those living through the early modern centuries, the change felt more like grace. The 17th century had been the heart of the frost, the time of frozen rivers, ruined crops, and desperate adaptation. But by the early 1700s, the balance began to tip. The storms that had plagued the North Atlantic grew weaker. Summers lengthened slightly. Crops once thought unreliable began to recover. Vineyards, long vanished from southern England, were replanted. Wheat, once rare in the north, began to thrive again. The sea lanes, no longer bound by months of ice, carried trade deeper into the year. But climate alone did not bring relief. Humanity had learned, painfully, how to survive the cold. And in doing so, it had changed the very structure of its civilization. The tools of endurance become the tools of progress. Throughout the cold centuries, the struggle for warmth and survival had driven innovation in small, practical ways. Better mills, improved crop rotations, more efficient storage. By the time the world began to warm, those small adaptations had accumulated into something remarkable, a foundation for modern society. In Northern Europe, the heavy plough and the horse collar, both perfected during the cold, made agriculture more productive than ever before. In the Netherlands, windmills that once pumped water from flooded fields became engines of industry, powering sawmills and textile workshops. In the German states and Scandinavia, iron production, adapted to endure frigid winters, expanded rapidly. Tools became sturdier and with them the ability to build. Even the simplest acts of preservation, salting, smoking, fermenting, evolved into crafts and trades. Cheese-making, beer, brewing and cured meats became regional identities, born from necessity and refined into culture. It was as if centuries of hardship had been quietly storing potential, waiting for a slightly warmer world to release it. The human geography of cold. The cold had also redrawn Europe's map. Villages that could not endure were abandoned, while others, those near rivers, forests, and trade routes, became centers of resilience. Over time, these survivors grew into towns, and those towns into cities. The densest medieval populations had once been inland, near farmlands. After the Little Ice Age, life shifted toward coasts and rivers, places where trade could supplement failed harvests. This subtle migration shaped the very skeleton of Europe's modern geography. Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and London rose as maritime hubs not only because of exploration, but because cold had driven people toward the water, where life was just a little more manageable. Even art followed the chill. Painters like Peter Bruegel the Elder depicted peasants skating and huddling beside frozen ponds, not as novelty but as reality. Later, as warmth returned, the landscape softened. The frozen world faded into nostalgia, a memory of struggle turned picturesque. The spiritual aftermath. In the quiet centuries of frost, faith had been both shield and burden. People had prayed for warmth, and when it came they saw it as a sign of renewal. Yet, something had changed in the spiritual imagination of Europe. The endless cold had forced people to think about nature not only as divine will, but as a force with its own rhythms and laws. By the 1600s and 1700s, scholars began to keep precise temperature records. Observatories measured sunlight and rainfall. What began as curiosity slowly grew into science, and with it, a new relationship between humanity and the climate. The weather, once interpreted through sin and salvation, was now something to be studied, perhaps even understood. The cold had taught people humility but also inquiry. Still, religion did not vanish from the narrative. It adapted, just as people had. The idea of divine order, that even the frost had purpose, gave comfort to those who still feared its return. The cold that created empires in a strange way. The cold also helped Europe look outward. The Little Ice Age coincided with the age of exploration, a time when ships, reinforced for northern seas, ventured further than ever before. The search for new trade routes, new resources, and warmer lands drove colonial ambition. Northern Europe, hardened by generations of scarcity, became restless. It sought warmth in other continents. The great maritime powers, England, the Netherlands, and later Scandinavia, were nations shaped by frost, by necessity, by precision born of survival. Their shipbuilders knew how to seal wood against ice, their sailors how to navigate storms, their merchants how to plan for months without sun. The endurance forged by winter became a kind of quiet empire, building discipline. And so, the story of the Little Ice Age was not only about suffering, it was also about transformation. Memory and architecture, the physical traces of the cold still linger, even now in Europe's oldest buildings. Thick stone walls, steep roofs, narrow windows, all built to trap heat and shed snow. The low ceilings of cottages, the central hearths, the clustered layouts of medieval towns, all were shaped by the long winters. Even when the climate warmed, people continued to build as if the frost might return. Churches remained dim and heavy, houses huddled close together. It wasn't merely habit, it was memory cast in stone. In England, the word Ingelnook, a warm corner by the fire, entered the language. In Germany, Kachelfen, tiled stoves, became symbols of home. The architecture of warmth was not simply practical, it was psychological, an answer to centuries of cold. The art of remembering winter as warmth returned. Artists began to remember the cold almost fondly. Paintings of snow-covered villages became a genre of their own. Poets described frost not as punishment but as beauty. The frost that had once starved families became a symbol of purity, of stillness, of time itself. The same societies that had once prayed for its end now romanticized its silence. In this reversal lies something deeply human, our ability to turn suffering into story. To look back at the struggle for survival and see, not only hardship, but endurance, a kind of quiet nobility. The cold once feared became part of identity, the legacy beneath our feet even in modern times. The lessons of medieval winter linger invisibly in the soil, in the way cities plan, in the way people think about scarcity. Crop diversification, long storage, trade networks, and the careful balance between local and distant supply, all are echoes of the medieval response to the cold. Our systems of food security, our global markets, even our understanding of climate resilience owe something to that ancient endurance. The medieval villager, sealing the door with straw against a January wind, would never have imagined it, but his survival instincts became the foundation of a civilization. The final winters the Little Ice Age did not end with a bang, but with a slow retreat. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, winters softened, rivers froze less often, vineyards crept northward again. The frost fairs on the Thames, once a joyful constant, became rarer. The last great one took place in 1814, under the reign of George III. It lasted only 4 days before the ice broke. The newspapers called it a marvel. No one realized it would be the last. Soon after, the Industrial Revolution warmed the cities, altered the air, and began the age of machines. The world was heating, first by coal, then by consequence. The frost withdrew, and with it, an entire way of life. But even as the cold faded, it left behind something enduring: the memory of patience. The lesson of the cold: to live through a medieval winter was to live with limits, of warmth, of light, of food, of hope. It taught people to plan, to share, to endure without certainty of reward. In a modern world preoccupied with speed and abundance, that lesson feels distant, almost quaint. Yet, as the climate changes once more, this time toward heat instead of cold, the wisdom of those long winters may be worth remembering. They knew how to prepare, how to ration, how to find comfort in small things. They understood, perhaps better than we do now, that nature does not bend to will. It must be lived with, not conquered. Echoes of frost. If you walk through a medieval village today, somewhere in the quiet valleys of England, or among the timbered houses of Germany, you can still feel it. The weight of that history. The way the houses lean inward, as if still bracing against a wind that has not blown for centuries. You can almost imagine the smell of smoke, the slow crackle of the hearth, the silence of a night when the snow mutes every sound. History has many loud moments, battles, revolutions, inventions, but sometimes the most enduring ones are quiet. The centuries of cold that shaped Europe did not shout. They whispered. And their whisper remains in stone, in story, and in the rhythm of survival. The thaw, when spring finally returned, when the soil loosened and the birds sang again, people celebrated not with parades but with work. They tilled, planted, rebuilt. There was no triumph, only gratitude. The thaw was not the end of hardship, but it was a reminder that endurance has meaning, that after centuries of frost, life still found a way to bloom. And so the long cold ended, not with victory but with renewal. Still, one wonders, as our own climate now shifts again, in a different direction, what will the people centuries from now remember about our seasons? Will they too whisper about us as the ones who endured, or the ones who forgot the lessons of the frost? If you had lived in Europe in the 14th century, you would have smelled bread before you saw it. It wasn't the fluffy, golden loaf of modern bakeries. It was heavier, darker, closer to the earth. A mixture of grains and grindings, often coarse enough to scrape the tongue. And yet, for most of Europe's population, bread was not just food. It was life itself. The medieval world ran on grain the way ours runs on electricity. Without it, nothing worked. Not the economy, not the household, not even religion. And once that grain was baked into bread, the question became as old as civilization itself: how to make it last. A day's work in Duff, the medieval baker, was an early riser, though often not by choice. Long before dawn, he would light the communal oven, a massive stone structure shared by an entire village or neighborhood. The air would fill with the smell of smoke and damp ash as the fire was fed hour after hour, heating the stones until they glowed faintly red. Wood was precious, so the fire had to be used wisely. Once the right temperature was reached, the embers were swept aside, and the day's dough was brought in, shaped by dozens of hands, kneaded in kitchens still half asleep. In towns, baking was a regulated profession. Guilds oversaw weights, measures, and prices. The assize of bread, first issued in 13th century England, dictated exactly how much a loaf should weigh according to the cost of wheat. Too light, and the baker could be fined, or worse. In villages, where rules were looser, bread was simpler but more precarious. Ovens were communal, and their schedules strict. Families marked their loaves with small patterns or symbols, a cross, a slash, a family sign, to tell them apart once baked. But baking was only half the battle. The true art lay in keeping the bread edible beyond the day it was made. Why bread went stale so fast: flour, water, yeast, and salt, 4 ingredients, and an unending struggle against time. Medieval bread, especially that made from barley, rye, or oats, began hardening within hours. Without preservatives or refined flour, moisture escaped quickly. Air and humidity turned crust to stone and crumb to dust. For poorer households, bread had to last days, sometimes a week. Few could afford to bake daily, and fewer still had enough fuel to fire an oven more than once or twice a week. So, people learned small tricks, part chemistry, part habit, part superstition, to keep the loaf from turning to rock before it could be eaten. Bread of the people, bread of the poor in a 14th century village. Bread came in many names and grades, each tied to class. Manchet, the fine, white loaf of the wealthy, made from sifted wheat flour. Soft, delicate, perishable. Maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, more common among the middling sort. Denser, longer lasting. Rye or barley bread, the food of labourers, dark, tangy and durable. Pea or bean bread, a last resort in hard years, made with ground legumes when grain ran short. The poor preferred their loaves heavy for a reason: they lasted longer. The more bran, the more fibre, and the slower the decay. What we might call stale, today was to them merely mature. A loaf might begin as soft bread on Sunday, turn to soup thickener by Wednesday, and end the week as crumbs in a pottage or beer mash. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. Storage, the science of dryness. In most medieval homes, the concept of storage was literal, keeping things off the ground. Bread was never left on a table. It sat on wooden shelves or was hung from the ceiling in linen sacks, away from damp floors and rodents. In wealthier houses, bread cupboards, small ventilated chests, were used, often carved with decorative holes to let air circulate. The secret wasn't to keep the bread soft, but to keep it dry. Moisture meant mold. Dryness meant endurance. The logic was simple but effective. A loaf too soft would rot. A loaf hard as stone could always be revived with liquid, broth, ale, or milk. Bread was, in essence, designed to die slowly. Reviving the unrevivable. When bread grew too tough to chew, people didn't throw it away. They transformed it. Hard bread could be soaked in beer for breakfast, a dish known in parts of Germany as bier-sup, a warm, yeasty porridge. In France, stale bread became the base for panade, a thick soup with onions and herbs. In England, it might be boiled with milk to create sops, the ancestor of pudding. The practice of dipping bread wasn't indulgence, it was technology. It made the inedible edible again, and stretched supplies through hunger months. And so, every meal was a quiet act of recycling. The same loaf lived many lives before it was gone. The taste of preservation, salt was precious, but in some regions it was used sparingly in dough to slow mold growth. In colder months, people stored loaves near the hearth, but not too close. Warmth invited damp. In coastal towns, the salty air itself lent the bread a longer life. Some bakers experimented with honey or balm yeast from beer brewing, or vinegar to extend freshness. These additions weren't called preservatives, but they were exactly that, organic chemistry born of observation. Over generations, these experiments hardened into tradition. Recipes were never written down, they were remembered by muscle and smell. Communal baking and the measure of time. Because ovens were shared, baking days were social events. Families gathered around the oven, chatting, trading news, even gossiping while their loaves browned. The heat of the oven was communal, its fire sacred. Some villages paid an oven rent, a small fee to the lord for the privilege of using his hearth. Others maintained their own public ovens, cared for by appointed oven keepers. If you baked too early or too late, your bread might burn or be underdone, and there were no second chances until next week. Thus, bread shaped not only meals but time itself. The week revolved around the baking day. The freshness of a loaf told you what day it was. Monday, soft; Thursday, firm; Saturday, hard as stone. In a world without clocks or calendars, the crust of a loaf was a calendar of its own. The bakers' guilds and urban control in towns and cities, bread took on a more political role. By the 14th century, bread was so central to urban stability that its supply was monitored by law. The size of bread in England, pain de roi, regulations in France, and similar rules elsewhere fixed not just prices, but how long loaves were allowed to sit on the shelf before sale. Inspectors, called allotasters in England or les jurés du pain in France, visited bakeries to weigh loaves and test freshness. Stale bread sold as new was a punishable offence. Yet, in poorer districts, many bakers quietly sold yesterday's bread for less. It was legal greyness and survival for the hungry. Markets often had two tiers: fresh bread for those who could afford it, and yesterday's loaf for those who could not. Both were eaten, both necessary. Bread and belief. Bread was never just food. It was holy matter. The Eucharist, the consecrated host in Christian ritual, was the purest and most sacred form of bread. It symbolized life itself, unspoiled and eternal. But that ideal stood in constant tension with the daily struggle of ordinary loaves that grew moldy by the week. In monasteries, bakers often prayed as they needed, invoking saints to protect the grain. The act of baking became a spiritual labor, transforming the raw gift of the earth into sustenance. The line between sacred and profane bread blurred. Every loaf carried a kind of quiet reverence, a reminder that what kept the body alive might also feed the soul. Bread in times of famine, when harvests failed, as they often did during the colder years of the 14th century, bread took on desperate forms. Records from France, Germany, and England describe famine breads, loaves mixed with acorns, bark, or ground roots. They were bitter, barely edible, and often harmful, yet they kept people alive. In extreme times, even sawdust was added to flour to stretch supplies. Chroniclers described these loaves as black as night and heavy as sin. Such bread rarely stayed fresh, but freshness hardly mattered when hunger ruled. What mattered was bulk, the illusion of fullness, the reassurance of something to chew. The Lord's loaf and the peasant's crust. In a manor household, the Lord's table might see fresh white loaves daily. Servants sliced them into trenchers, thick slabs used as edible plates. After the meal, these greasy bread plates were given to the poor or to the hounds. Even in generosity, hierarchy was baked in. The poor ate what had already served its purpose. Yet the peasant's coarse rye bread, though mocked by nobles, could last for days longer. Durability had its dignity. What was soft decayed, what was hard endured. Measuring time in crumbs, bread shaped not only diets, but the rhythm of life and the memory of hunger. In account rolls, priests recorded the number of loaves baked per feast. In city archives, fines for underweight bread appear beside records of theft and assault, proof that to cheat in bread was nearly as grave as to steal a life. And in every home, large or small, people knew the signs. The smell of yeast meant plenty. The sound of cracking crust meant Sunday. The silence of an empty shelf meant hunger. The small miracles of preservation in hindsight. Their methods were primitive, but within those crude techniques lay wisdom, control of moisture, air, and temperature that modern science would later rediscover. They understood fermentation as a living process, though they could not name microbes. They recognized that acidity delayed spoilage, that dryness prevented mold, that grain quality mattered more than any recipe. Their world was empirical, built on observation, refined by necessity. Every loaf was a small experiment in survival. By nightfall, the day's bread would cool and harden. The smell of smoke would fade, leaving only the quiet of stored loaves and sleeping ovens. Somewhere, in a village house, a woman would hang her remaining bread in a cloth sack, whispering a prayer that it would last until the next baking day. And in that act, so simple, so forgettable, she joined the long, unbroken story of human endurance. Still, one might wonder, how did bread, this humble daily miracle, come to define not just diet but destiny, to spark revolts, feed armies, and shape empires? Bread to the medieval mind was not only nourishment but currency. It moved through society the way coins do today, counted, weighed, taxed, and traded. And though it appeared humble, its freshness, or lack thereof, could determine the peace or collapse of an entire city. To understand the art of keeping bread fresh, one must first understand the invisible system that decided who got fresh bread at all. The grain road. Everything began with the harvest. In a typical 14th century European village, most families grew a mixture of wheat, barley, rye, and oats. But ownership of that grain was complicated. The lord of the manor usually claimed a portion as rent. The church took a tithe, 1/10 of all yield. Then came taxes, mill fees, and transport costs. By the time a farmer's grain reached the oven, it might already have passed through a dozen hands, and each of those hands, the miller, the baker, the merchant, sought their share. The result was a chain of dependency, where the poorest grew the food, but rarely ate it fresh. The freshest bread belonged to those who could pay for immediacy. To eat the same day it was baked, without waiting, without bargaining. For everyone else, bread aged by the hour. The baker and the law. In most medieval towns, baking was a licensed trade. You could not simply set up a stall and sell bread. You needed permission from the guild. The guild was both protector and enforcer. It ensured bread met official standards, the right weight, the right flour, the right price. But it also protected its members from competition. When wheat prices rose, the guild negotiated with city officials to raise loaf prices accordingly. But there was always a lag. If you baked too early, you risked selling below cost. Too late, and your bread grew stale, worth less. The baker's world was ruled by the clock, not of hours, but of moisture. Even freshness was an economy. Bread as a measure of justice, the size of bread and ale, first codified in England in 1266, was one of the earliest consumer protection laws in Europe. It dictated how much bread should cost relative to the price of wheat. If wheat was cheap, loaves grew larger. If wheat prices rose, loaves shrank, but the price stayed fixed. The law was meant to protect the poor from exploitation, but in practice, it often protected no one. Bakers found creative ways to cut costs, mixing cheaper grains, shortening fermentation, or baking smaller loaves that appeared larger through clever shaping. And when inspectors, called alitasters, came through the markets, disputes erupted. Some bakers were fined, others imprisoned. Yet the people themselves often defended their local baker, for he was the one who kept their bellies filled. Bread was law, but it was also trust. Once that trust broke, revolts began. When freshness became a spark in times of famine, especially during the early 1300s, when colder weather and excessive rain led to poor harvests, the bread supply became dangerously tight. Cities began rationing grain, storing it in public granaries, and issuing official loaves known as pain du roi, the king's bread. The loaves were often coarse, small and old. But hunger is not patient. When citizens saw bakers selling fresh, white loaves to the wealthy while the poor gnawed at yesterday's black rye, anger boiled. In Paris, Florence, London and Ghent, records show dozens of bread riots. They rarely began with violence, only with demand. Crowds gathered demanding fair bread. But once the ovens were stormed, the riots spread. The freshness of bread, that small detail of timing, became a symbol of fairness itself. To eat stale bread meant waiting, submitting, accepting one's place. To eat fresh bread was a luxury, a statement of dignity. And so, in a sense, freshness became political. The church and the loaf, the church's relationship to bread was both sacred and economic. Every tithe collected from harvests passed partly through ecclesiastical hands. Monasteries became major centers of baking, supplying not only their own members but nearby towns and travelers. Their bread was often considered purer, baked under vows of prayer, but purity had a price. Monks used fine flour, sifted through multiple cloths. Their loaves stayed soft and white for only a short time, making them perfect for religious feasts, but poor for long storage. Meanwhile, peasants continued baking their dense, durable loaves, built to survive days of labor. Thus, even in religion, class divided the loaf, one for the altar, one for the field. Yet monasteries also became early innovators in preservation. Some experimented with drying bread in low heat after baking, creating what we might call rusks or hardtack, bread that could last months. These were not luxuries but tools of endurance, food for monks traveling on pilgrimage, or for feeding the poor during winters of scarcity. In their silence and slow labor, monks discovered the chemistry of shelf life. Bread as wages in towns, bread was often used as part of payment. Builders, masons, and even some clerks received loaves as a daily allowance, known in Latin as panis ad stipendium, bread as stipend. The freshness of this bread reflected the stability of one's employment. Fresh bread daily meant regular pay. Stale bread or none at all meant dismissal or debt. Household servants were likewise given bread rations, and these were carefully tracked in ledgers. One surviving record from 14th century Norwich lists servants receiving 2 loaves white, 3 loaves brown per diem per man. Even here, hierarchy baked itself into the crumb. White for the upper servants, brown for the lower. Bread was more than food. It was identity. The long shadow of the mill behind every loaf stood the miller, a figure as essential as he was distrusted. Milling grain was costly, and millers took a toll in kind, a portion of every sack ground. Some took more than their due, so much so that, honest as a miller, became a medieval joke. The quality of milling also determined how long bread would last. Coarse flour spoiled faster because bran held moisture and oil. Fine flour made lighter, quicker staling loaves. Villagers learned to balance their grind for durability. The ideal was neither too fine nor too coarse, just enough to hold water but not mold. Bread was not baked freshness alone, it was engineered through centuries of practical chemistry. Fresh bread for the few in noble households, the luxury of daily baking meant loaves were always fresh. Servants rose early to knead and bake in private ovens. The smell of newly baked bread filled the hall each morning, signaling wealth as clearly as the banners on the walls. But this privilege carried hidden waste. The leftovers of one day's feast became the sops and trenchers of the next. Even stale bread had hierarchy, eaten by servants, then passed to beggars, then to swine. The poor might have envied the rich their fresh loaves, but they also knew that freshness came at the cost of waste, something they could not afford. Their own stale loaves, hard but honest, were meant to last. Thus, the stale bread of the poor fed more mouths than the soft bread of the rich. The grain market and the wheel of fortune, grain merchants were the unseen hands behind every price. They followed the harvests from region to region, buying low and selling high. In years of plenty, their profit was modest. In years of famine, it was vast. Governments tried to intervene, issuing grain bans to prevent exports during shortages. But smuggling was common. A single ship of wheat sent abroad could mean hunger at home. Bread riots often targeted these merchants, not bakers, for it was believed that hoarded grain was the true enemy. And sometimes it was. Records from Bruges in 1315, during the Great Famine, tell of granaries broken open by desperate crowds, their contents scattered or seized. Authorities condemned the act as theft. Chroniclers called it survival, hunger as teacher when the weather turned cruel. As it did across much of Europe between 1315 and 1317, entire harvests failed. Rain-drowned fields, rot spread in barns, and stored grain grew moldy before winter began. With no surplus, bread prices tripled. Bakers shuttered their ovens, unwilling to bake at a loss. The poor boiled grass and roots, or ground acorns into meal. In some villages, records show people mixing dust of old loaves, ground stale bread, into new dough, trying to stretch what little grain remained. Even in famine, they practiced the art of keeping bread alive, one loaf feeding the next, the ghost of old sustenance reborn in every need. It was, in its way, a kind of continuity. The bread was never entirely new, it carried memory. The return of plenty. When harvests improved and markets reopened, the people's first act was to bake again. Baking symbolized renewal. The smell of fresh bread marked not just the end of hunger, but the return of hope. Festivals were held around the first bake of the new grain. Priests blessed the loaves, families stored crumbs for luck. Freshness, after all, was temporary, a fleeting luxury to be cherished before time and air claimed it again. The silent lesson, the economics of bread, were invisible to those who lived by them. But they shaped the world profoundly. Every loaf sold, every crumb saved or thrown away, reflected choices and hierarchies that spanned fields, cities, and thrones. And in the quiet space between baking and staling, between abundance and hunger, the medieval world revealed its greatest truth: survival depended on timing. Too soon, and bread was raw. Too late, and it was stone. In between lay the narrow window of life itself. So, when you think of a medieval loaf, dark, dense, drying on a wooden shelf, imagine the invisible network behind it, the hands that harvested the wheat, the laws that priced it, the bakers who risked punishment to sell it, and the hungry crowds who waited for it to cool. The bread was never just bread. It was the heartbeat of an entire civilization. And yet, one might still ask, as centuries turned and ovens multiplied, how did this humble, hard-won loaf evolve into a symbol of both revolution and modernity? What happened when bread itself became political power? It is easy to forget, centuries later, that revolutions often begin with something ordinary: the missing loaf, the empty market stall, the smell of bread that only the rich can afford. In the medieval and early modern world, bread was more than food. It was the measure of justice, the symbol of fairness, the daily proof of whether the system worked or failed. And when that proof disappeared, the people rose. But before bread became a banner of revolt, it was first a quiet grievance, centuries in the making. The bread of feudal order in the late medieval world, bread symbolized hierarchy. The Lord's table groaned under fresh manchet loaves, white, soft, and easily spoiled. The peasant's home stored dark rye bread that could outlast the week. The difference was more than flavor. It was duration, a hierarchy of time. To eat fresh bread daily meant one's life was shielded from scarcity. To eat stale bread was to live always on the edge of uncertainty. When famine struck, this imbalance sharpened. The poor, dependent on communal ovens and taxed grain, starved first. The rich merely paid more for their wheat. Bread was fairness made visible. Every loaf on the table was a mirror of inequality. The grain riots of the late Middle Ages, as Europe grew denser and more urban, cities became increasingly dependent on distant grain supplies. When harvests failed, urban hunger turned political. In the 14th and 15th centuries, bread riots became a recurring rhythm of city life. In Florence, Ghent, Paris, and London, the pattern was nearly identical each time. Rumors of hoarded grain spread first. Bakers' stalls were raided next. Then, the crowd would march to city granaries or guild halls, demanding release of stored grain at a fair price. These weren't lawless mobs, at least not in their own eyes. Chroniclers noted how rioters often paid for bread after seizing it, or left coins on counters. Their message wasn't theft, it was protest. Bread should not belong only to those who can afford freshness. Bread and the birth of the common good. By the 16th century, governments began to understand the political danger of hunger. Bread prices were monitored like modern fuel prices, essential to public calm. In France, the crown created the police des grains, officials charged with ensuring fair distribution and preventing hoarding. In England, municipal bakers were required to keep loaves ready for emergencies, under threat of fine or imprisonment. Cities built public granaries, subsidized by taxes. In times of dearth, these stores released grain to the market below cost, an early form of welfare. These acts weren't born of charity, they were born of fear. A hungry crowd could destroy a city faster than an invading army. Bread as the currency of authority. Kings understood this balance intimately. When they kept the ovens burning, they ruled in peace. When they failed, they fell. One of the earliest recorded bread crises occurred under King John of England in the early 1200s, when famine and heavy taxation coincided. His unpopularity wasn't just about lost wars or noble grievances, it was about hunger. Chronicles mention peasants eating corns and carrion, their bread gone. The king's image as a failed provider became legend, echoed centuries later in tales of tyrants who let their people starve. Even monarchs who ruled by divine right understood that divinity did not bake bread. The real power was yeast, grain, and time, things no crown could command. The long hunger, as the centuries passed, climate once again turned cold. The period now called the Little Ice Age, stretching from roughly the 14th to the 19th centuries, brought erratic harvests and long winters. Each cycle of scarcity reignited the same tension between the freshness of privilege and the staleness of poverty. In France, this divide deepened steadily. Urbanization and population growth outpaced grain supply. By the 18th century, bread had become the single largest expense for working families, often 50 to 80% of income. When grain prices rose, everything else fell apart. Wages didn't rise with them. And so, as ever, the question of who could afford fresh bread became the question of who deserved to live. Let them eat cake. The myth of misunderstanding, it is perhaps the most famous and most misunderstood line in history. Let them eat cake. And no record shows Marie Antoinette ever said it. The phrase first appeared decades earlier in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, describing a nameless great princess. But even as myth, it captured a deep truth: the gulf between those who baked and those who starved. To the French poor of the 1780s, the phrase symbolized indifference, the luxury of those who never had to think about keeping bread fresh, because someone else always did it for them. When Paris ran short of bread in 1789, the city was already a powder keg. Prices had doubled. The king's stores were full, but distribution faltered. Crowds gathered, demanding du pain, bread, nothing more. It was this cry, not liberty, not equality, but bread, that carried them to the gates of Versailles. Bread and the French Revolution in October 1789. Thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles through cold autumn rain. Many carried loaves of black bread skewered on pikes. They weren't symbolic, they were evidence. The proof of decay, of hunger, of failure. When they reached the palace, they demanded two things: lower bread prices and the king's return to Paris. They got both. In the months that followed, bakers became political figures. Bread distribution was centralized, rationed, militarized. Posters announced daily bread weights and prices. In revolutionary France, the right to bread became the right to citizenship itself. Without it, the republic meant nothing. One Parisian decree read simply, "The people do not live by laws, they live by bread." And so, the politics of freshness, once a matter of survival in a medieval village, had become the foundation of a modern revolution. Bread and industry, the Industrial Revolution, in the centuries that followed, finally broke this ancient rhythm. Steam mills, mechanized kneading, and chemical leavening transformed the very texture of bread. The need to preserve freshness gave birth to packaging, additives, and daily deliveries. Bread became consistent, predictable, no longer tied to weather or harvest. But in this progress, something vanished. The rhythm of the oven, the smell of the weekly bake, the calendar of staleness that once marked the passage of days, all faded into mechanized regularity. What had once been the art of preservation became the science of production. Bread as memory, yet even now, traces of that old world remain. The custom of breaking bread together, the superstition of turning loaves upright on tables, the reverence of not wasting crumbs, all echo a time when bread's survival meant our own. The word companion itself comes from Latin, companis, with bread. To share bread was to share life. And perhaps that is why, even today, the smell of baking bread feels like home. It awakens something ancient, the security of warmth, the promise that the hunger of yesterday might not return. The stale lesson of history, the story of bread, from the 14th century to now, is a story of patience and fragility, of fire and water, of law and rebellion, of a people learning loaf by loaf that fairness must be renewed as often as bread itself. The medieval woman hanging her bread in a linen sack so it would last the week, the Parisian mother shouting, "Bread!" outside Versailles, the modern worker buying sliced loaves sealed in plastic. Each belongs to the same lineage. Each one measures time in crumbs. So as night settles over our long history, imagine the glow of an old communal oven, its fire dimming, its stones cooling. The last loaves are stacked neatly, cooling in silence. Tomorrow they will be a little harder. The day after, perhaps too hard to eat. And yet, somehow, they will feed another day, soaked in broth, shared among family, still sustaining life. It is a small miracle that repeats itself across centuries. And maybe that is history's quietest truth, that civilization is nothing more than the long struggle to keep bread fresh. Imagine a world without switches, without the faint hum of wires hidden behind plaster, without the guarantee that a single flick of the hand will call forth light. Night falls, and that's it. You feel the world close around you, the horizon dissolving into shadow, familiar streets becoming quiet, formless shapes. The air cools, the hearth flickers, and what's left of the day disappears with the sun. For most of human history, this was not simply poetic darkness. It was a fact of existence, a border drawn by nature itself. The people of medieval and early modern Europe did not lose hours to the night, they adapted to it. They learned to live between the candle's flicker and the moon's pale rhythm, crafting a life that belonged as much to shadow as to daylight. This is the story of that forgotten world, when light was labor, when darkness was a companion, and when the small, steady flame of a candle was a mark of civilization itself. When daylight ended in the medieval countryside, sunset meant cessation. Fields emptied, mills went quiet, forges cooled. Without artificial light, labor simply stopped. Peasants went home to their cottages, where one fire served as both heat and light. The hearth was the only constant source of illumination, its glow uneven and smoky, more orange than white, more suggestion than sight. The wealthy, however, pushed night back a little further. Inside stone halls or timbered manors, servants lit rushlights and tallow candles, one by one, often using embers carried from the day's cooking fire. The ritual of lighting a home was slow and deliberate. Each flame was a choice, and every hour of light had a price. The price of light before electricity. Light was expensive, astonishingly so. The poorest households in 13th and 14th century England often used nothing more than rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat, burning for about 15 minutes before needing replacement. The middle class might afford tallow candles, made from rendered sheep or ox fat. They smoked heavily, gave off a pungent smell, and left greasy soot on ceilings and walls. The wealthy nobles, clergy, merchants reserved beeswax candles for sacred or formal occasions. Beeswax burned clean, evenly, and with a golden glow. But it was costly. A single pound of beeswax could cost a laborer several days' wages. Light, in other words, was a visible marker of wealth. To have a room lit after dark was a form of status, the difference between a household that could continue working or reading at night, and one that simply went to bed when the sun disappeared. The rhythm of two sleeps before the advent of artificial light. People did not sleep as we do now. The night was long, often stretching 14 or 15 hours in winter. Most households divided it into two distinct periods, first sleep and second sleep. Historical diaries and court records from across Europe describe this rhythm. People went to bed shortly after dusk, slept for several hours, then woke in the middle of the night, around midnight, for an hour or two of quiet activity before returning to sleep until dawn. During that interval, families might stir the fire, pray, whisper, tend to livestock, or even visit neighbors. It was a calm, reflective period, a pocket of stillness that belonged entirely to the night. Some called it the watching hour. In monasteries, it was the time of matins, the first prayers of the day. In villages, it was a moment of half-wakeful solitude, a time when thoughts stretched differently, shaped by shadow rather than sunlight. This segmented sleep pattern persisted for centuries. It vanished only when cities brightened, clocks standardized time, and artificial lighting made night feel continuous. Firelight as furniture, because light was precious, rooms were arranged around it. The hearth dominated not just the kitchen but the rhythm of domestic life. People sat close not merely for warmth, but to see one another's faces, to read a letter, to mend, to eat. The modern idea of private lighting, a lamp for every room, did not exist. Instead, light moved with people. Servants carried candles in iron or brass holders as they walked, shielding them from drafts with cupped hands. Travelers on the road at night carried lanterns, their small circles of glow flickering like ghosts between hedgerows. Public lighting, even in major cities, was minimal. In medieval London or Paris, street lamps were rare before the 17th century. Night watchmen carried torches and called the hours, their voices echoing through empty streets. The rest of the city slept in near total blackness. The labor of making candles was an art of patience and smell. Tallow candles began with the rendering of fat, a process both time-consuming and unpleasant. The fat had to be boiled, strained, and poured repeatedly to remove impurities. The resulting substance was then shaped around wicks made of twisted linen or hemp. Beeswax, by contrast, came from hives. Each ounce represented the work of thousands of bees, and the trade in wax became an early form of international commerce. Monasteries and churches often kept apiaries, not for honey but for light. Beeswax candles were indispensable in liturgical life, their slow, steady flames symbolizing purity. The church even prescribed that only beeswax candles could be used at the altar. Thus, a quiet economy of bees, monks, and merchants sustained the spiritual illumination of medieval Europe. In both cases, light was born of labor, human or animal, divine or mundane. Every candle burned down was time made visible, effort made ephemeral. Night work and watchmen, though most people slept, some did not. Bakers began their work after midnight, preparing dough for the dawn market. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, announcing the hours and calling out fires. In larger towns, taverns and inns offered refuge for travelers who dared the darkness. These nocturnal figures lived in a world most others never saw, one ruled by sound rather than sight. They navigated by memory, by smell, by touch. Their world was muffled, close, secretive. For them, candlelight wasn't luxury but tool. A guttering tallow stub was enough to light the way through storerooms, cellars, or narrow streets. The bare minimum illumination that turned the invisible world visible again. The fragrance of darkness before electricity had its own texture and scent. Homes filled with a mix of smoke, wax, and oil. The smell of burning tallow lingered in curtains and clothes. The fire popped, embers sighed, and the sound of the wind outside became a kind of lullaby. For centuries, this atmosphere, dim, smoky, quiet, defined human night. It was a shared sensory experience across class and geography, from English manors to Italian cottages. What we call coziness today was, for them, necessity. The fear of the night, yet not all darkness was gentle. Without light, fear took on shapes of its own. Wolves, thieves, and spirits all belonged to the nocturnal imagination. People marked thresholds with protective charms, or placed a single candle in a window to keep away wandering souls. The belief that flame protected against evil was nearly universal. Even rational minds accepted the comfort of light. The glow of a candle was both barrier and beacon, a fragile assertion that civilization still held against the unknown. The candle as symbol in time, the candle came to stand for more than illumination. It was a metaphor for life itself, finite, melting, radiant while it lasted. Poets compared the soul to a flickering wick. Monks wrote sermons on the symbolism of wax, pure, pliant, consumed for light. In royal ceremonies, candles represented eternal vigilance. In funerals, they marked the journey from darkness to rest. In ordinary homes, they marked the end of one day and the hope for another. Even the act of snuffing a candle carried meaning. To extinguish light before sleep was to surrender willingly to the unknown. A nightly rehearsal of mortality, met not with fear, but with quiet acceptance. The world by candlelight. If you could step back into a medieval home at night, around the year 1300, you would find yourself in a world of half light. Faces would appear softer, voices lower, the air thicker. Shadows would stretch and merge, walls would vanish into obscurity. A single candle could transform the room, not merely by revealing, but by concealing. Light didn't conquer darkness, it coexisted with it. That balance, between glow and shadow, between safety and mystery, defined human nights for millennia. And as the flame danced, time slowed. The world shrank to a small circle of warmth, and outside it stretched an immensity of unlit earth, silent, infinite, waiting. But what happened when this balance began to shift? When the night no longer belonged to silence, but to industry? When cities glowed and the stars disappeared? The story of candlelight, like the flame itself, burns toward its end. not in sudden darkness but in gradual brightness. For thousands of years, human life followed the rhythm of light and dark, dawn to dusk, flame to shadow. But by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, that rhythm began to change. The long sleep of night was interrupted not by superstition, but by invention. The story of how darkness learned to work is not about sudden brilliance. It's about small, persistent efforts to hold back the night. One lamp, one street, one glowing window at a time. The first public lights, the earliest attempts to light entire cities, began tentatively, like experiments in taming a wild creature. In 1667, Louis XIV's Paris became the first European city to introduce organized street lighting. Wooden posts bearing oil lamps were placed at regular intervals, their flames shielded by glass panes. Each evening, hundreds of lamplighters, R.A. Verbe-rists, made their rounds, climbing ladders, trimming wicks, and touching flame to wick. It was an act both practical and theatrical, the nightly rebirth of civilization. Soon other cities followed. London, Amsterdam, and Berlin began similar programs. The transformation was immediate. Streets that had once vanished into blackness after sunset now flickered with steady, golden light. The fear of the dark lessened. Night became navigable. But even then, the light was fragile. Oil lamps guttered in the wind. The scent of whale oil and soot clung to the air. Rain could extinguish an entire street's worth of illumination. And yet, people began to stay awake longer. Taverns stayed open, markets lingered. The night, once a place of rest, became a place of life. The light of Wile's whale oil was the miracle and the tragedy of the 18th century's illumination. Extracted from sperm whales hunted in the Atlantic and Pacific, it produced a cleaner, steadier flame than tallow or common oils. It also launched one of the earliest global industries powered by darkness itself. Ships from New England and Europe sailed for years at a time, returning with barrels of oil that would illuminate the streets of London or the parlors of Boston. Each gallon represented the death of a creature from another world, traded for human brightness. The lamps it fed, known as argon lamps, after their Swiss inventor Aimé Argand, were marvels of the age. Introduced in the 1780s, they used a hollow circular wick and glass chimney to produce a steady, bright flame. By candlelight standards, it was revolutionary. A single argon lamp could replace 10 candles, burning longer and brighter. The world of the night had changed. For the first time, light became efficient, and industry, ever opportunistic, began to notice. Factories after sunset. By the early 19th century, light was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity, especially for those who worked. Factories, once bound by daylight, could now operate deep into the night. Lamps hung from rafters, their oil flames fed by the same hands that powered the machines. The rhythm of day and night fractured. Time became mechanical. In textile mills, workers labored under the dim yellow glow of oil lamps, inhaling both smoke and lint. The air was thick and hot, the smell acrid. Accidents increased. Fatigue became constant. The industrial night was not romantic, it was grueling. But it was also profitable. A factory that could operate 20 hours instead of 10 doubled its output. And so the logic of light became the logic of labor. The dark, once sacred for rest and reflection, became just another shift on the clock. The lamplighter's world outside the mills, another profession flourished, the lamplighter. In every major city, their rounds marked the rhythm of twilight. Carrying long poles tipped with small flames, lamplighters would move street by street, turning the city from black to gold. They were both guardians and performers, the human link between past darkness and modern brightness. Children followed them as they worked, watching the small miracles bloom one after another down the road. A good lamplighter could tend to hundreds of lamps in a single evening. They cleaned soot, trimmed wicks, replaced oil, and ensured the flame caught in one careful motion. To miss a lamp was to invite crime, to light one too early was wasteful. They lived by precision, like clockmakers of the night. And when morning came, they returned to snuff each lamp out, the slow reverse of their ritual, ending the night's borrowed brilliance. By the mid-19th century, they were among the most familiar silhouettes in urban life: ladder, pole, and steady flame against the dawn. The gaslight revolution. Then came gas. The first public gasworks opened in London in 1812 under the newly formed Gas Light and Coke Company. Instead of oil or wax, this light came from burning coal gas, a manufactured product piped through iron mains to lamps across the city. It was brighter, cheaper, and longer, lasting than anything before it. Gaslight turned London into the first true city that never slept. Theatres extended their shows, factories expanded their hours, public squares gleamed. By the 1840s, even middle-class homes had indoor gas jets controlled by brass taps. But this new brilliance came with hazards. The gas stank faintly of sulfur. Leaks could cause explosions. Carbon monoxide filled poorly ventilated rooms. Still, the fascination with constant light was unstoppable. Humanity had crossed a threshold, no longer content to let darkness define the limits of the day. The night was conquered, and with it, sleep began to shrink. The birth of the modern night, with gaslight came a new kind of nightlife. Cafes, dance halls, and reading clubs thrived. Artists and intellectuals met after dusk, their conversations stretching into early morning. The night was no longer the domain of fear, it was a stage for modernity. Writers like Charles Dickens wandered gaslit London, describing its strange beauty, fog swirling through lamplight, puddles reflecting glowing orbs above. Painters studied how artificial light changed color and shadow. Scientists measured its brightness. The very idea of night transformed, from danger to spectacle. Yet, in this victory, something quieter faded: the intimacy of candlelight. The shadows grew thinner, the mystery of the half-lit world. That slow, flickering conversation between flame and darkness began to vanish. Domestic light and social change. Gaslight also changed domestic life. For the first time, homes could be evenly lit. Parlors, once dim after sunset, became social spaces for longer hours. Women could sew, read, and write at night. Families gathered later. Time itself seemed to stretch. But this new freedom also carried expectations. Servants were expected to work longer. Children studied later. Employers sent correspondence deep into the evening. The candle's natural limit, that moment when light ran out and people rested, disappeared. Night became elastic, and with it came exhaustion that was new to the human experience. Where candlelight once whispered enough, gaslight said just a little more. The vanishing darkness. By the end of the 19th century, electric light began to replace gas, and the old world of lamplighters, tallow, and oil faded into memory. The sky above industrial cities glowed faintly all night, erasing the stars. The darkness that had once belonged to mystery, to contemplation, and to dreams, was now filled with the restless hum of human activity. The conquest of the night was nearly complete. But as the light grew brighter, people began to notice what they had lost. Writers spoke nostalgically of true night, the kind of darkness deep enough to feel like a second world. Astronomers complained of vanishing constellations. Rural visitors to cities found themselves unable to sleep under constant light. A strange longing began to grow for the deep, patient darkness that had once governed human rest. The light that worked too well. By teaching darkness to work, humanity had redefined not just its nights, but its pace. The night, once contemplative, became industrious. The flame, once symbolic, became functional. And yet, the irony was clear. The brighter the world became, the less clearly people could see what they'd replaced. The slow rhythms, the pauses, the sense that each night marked a boundary rather than a continuation. The industrial night illuminated everything except stillness. Now, as the 19th century draws toward its electric dawn, we find the old candlelight world flickering one last time. In small villages, in monasteries, in the quiet corners of homes not yet reached by wires. What would happen when electricity arrived? When even that faint boundary between light and dark dissolved entirely? Would the night still belong to rest, or would it become something else entirely? There is a certain irony in the fact that the quietest revolution in human history made no sound at all. No drums, no riots, no speeches, only a faint click, a small hum, and the sudden birth of light, clean, white, effortless. The electric light was not a single invention, but a long accumulation of experiments, mistakes, and sparks. Centuries of trying to make light permanent. And when it finally succeeded, it changed not just the night, but time itself. The dream of continuous day. In the late 19th century, after the long era of oil and gas, inventors began chasing a new idea: light without fire. Fire, for all its use, had always been dangerous and temporary. It smoked, it needed tending, it consumed oxygen, and it carried the ancient fragility of the flame. Electricity promised something almost divine. Light born from invisible energy, without heat, without smoke, without exhaustion. In 1879, after decades of experiments by many minds, Thomas Edison perfected a practical carbon filament bulb, one that could burn for more than 1,000 hours. He did not invent electric light, others had done that before him. But he made it reliable, reproducible, profitable. When Edison switched on the lights at his Menlo Park laboratory, the crowd that gathered described it as unnatural, too white, too steady, too alive. For the first time, people saw light that didn't flicker. It didn't move. It didn't fade with the wind. It simply was. And with that still, unwavering glow, night as humanity had known it for millennia began to vanish. The city transformed within a decade. Electric streetlights spread across major cities: New York, Paris, Berlin, London. The contrast was stunning. Gaslight, with its warm orange hue, gave way to a bright white glare that flattened shadows and banished the old amber tone of the night. Newspapers called it artificial day. Crowds gathered just to stare at the bulbs glowing above them, perfect spheres of radiance, buzzing faintly, like captured suns. In 1882, New York's Pearl Street Station became the world's first central power plant, lighting more than 400 lamps in homes and offices nearby. Those who lived under this glow described it as intoxicating. Shops stayed open later. Cafes bustled past midnight. Nighttime, once the boundary between one day and the next, became simply more day. But not everyone approved. Writers complained that electric light was too cruel, too honest, exposing every flaw, every wrinkle. Painters mourned the end of shadow. Philosophers called it the banishment of mystery. Still, the current kept spreading. The end of the lamplighter. For centuries, the lamplighter had been the symbol of urban dusk, a solitary figure pacing the streets, carrying flame. Electricity made him obsolete almost overnight. In city after city, lamplighters turned off their own lamps for the last time. Some were retrained as maintenance men for electrical grids, others simply vanished into history. The disappearance of the lamplighter was more than a change of profession. It marked the end of a human relationship with night, the last ritual of tending flame, replaced by a switch no one needed to think about. Light, once earned, became automatic, and what is automatic, humans soon stopped noticing. The household revolution, the arrival of electric lighting, transformed domestic life more radically than any previous invention. For the first time, homes could be brightly lit in every room. Cooking, cleaning, reading, sewing, all could continue long after sunset. The social evening extended deep into what had once been night's territory. The idea of bedtime shifted, sleep shortened, productivity lengthened. Electric light democratized brightness. What had once been a symbol of wealth, a well-lit room, became a standard expectation. By 1920, even modest urban apartments could glow with steady light at the turn of a switch. The human sense of time adjusted almost unconsciously. The evening ceased to mean rest, it became opportunity. Work, leisure, study, all spilled into hours that had once belonged to silence. Factories without dawn. In factories, the change was even more profound. Where oil lamps and gaslight had limited shifts, electric lighting erased the last natural boundary. Mills and assembly lines now operated around the clock. The phrase, graveyard shift, was born. For the first time in history, large populations worked through the night not out of necessity, but because the economy demanded it. The glow of electric bulbs inside factories became the emblem of industrial modernity, bright, unyielding, sleepless. The night had become productive, and with that, humanity stepped into a world where exhaustion was no longer the signal to stop, only an inconvenience to be managed. The brightness of empire electricity also became a symbol of progress and of control. Colonial administrators in Asia and Africa installed electric lighting in ports and capitals as a demonstration of power, a sign of civilization. Photographs from the early 20th century show glowing street lamps rising over dark, unlit villages nearby, a visible reminder of technological inequality. Light had always been a metaphor for knowledge and order. Now it was also an instrument of dominance. The world was being divided by brightness. The vanishing night sky before electricity, the stars had been humanity's oldest companions. Navigators steered by them. Farmers rid their seasons. Poets built entire philosophies around their constancy. But as the 20th century unfolded, their light began to fade, not because the stars changed, but because Earth did. By the 1930s, astronomers in major cities complained that the Milky Way was no longer visible. By the 1960s, entire constellations had vanished from the urban sky. This loss, though gradual, marked a profound shift in human perception. For the first time, the heavens became invisible. Generations grew up never knowing true darkness, the kind that once made every candle, every fire, every star seem infinite. Light as habit. By mid-century, the novelty of electric light had worn off. It was no longer wonder, it was expectation. Children were born into brightness and never questioned it. Night became fragmented, a blur of neon, headlights, television screens, and signs. The soft edges of candlelight were gone, replaced by sharp, white clarity, and with that clarity came sleeplessness. The human body, evolved to rest in darkness, struggled against the new constant day. Scientists began to notice that exposure to artificial light at night disrupted sleep cycles, altered hormones, and blurred the line between waking and dreaming. In conquering darkness, we had disturbed our oldest rhythm. the return of shadow, and yet, as the 21st century dawned, a quiet nostalgia began to stir. People lit candles again, not because they had to, but because they missed something: the softness, the silence, the shared moment around a small flame. Candlelight dinners, mood lighting, dark sky reserves, all were modern attempts to recover what had been lost, not just darkness, but the sense of presence that comes with it. Some towns began turning off streetlights late at night to save energy and restore the stars. Astronomers, artists, and environmentalists found common cause in the idea that darkness itself was worth protecting. It was a strange reversal. After centuries of striving to drive darkness away, humanity was beginning to miss it. The memory of fire. Think for a moment of the candle, its small, wavering flame. It demanded attention, patience, respect. It gave off just enough light to see, but not enough to dominate. It made shadows dance and time slow down. Every candle that burned was a reminder that light was not infinite, that every moment of brightness cost something. Wax melted, wicks shortened, hours slipped away, electricity erased that awareness. But somewhere deep in memory, the mind still recalls it. The faint scent of wax, the whisper of a match, the intimacy of a single flame shared in the dark. The light that never sleeps today. The world glows even at midnight. From orbit, cities appear as galaxies of their own. White and gold constellations spread across continents. The old border between night and day is gone. We have achieved what generations once dreamed: perpetual light. But it came at a cost. The stars have faded. The night has vanished. And somewhere, the small, flickering flame that once defined human existence, fragile, imperfect, temporary, has been replaced by a light that never goes out, but never truly warms. Perhaps that is why candlelight feels different, why people still turn to it in quiet moments. Not for brightness, but for balance. Not to see, but to remember how to see. Because in the steady hum of modern illumination, one truth remains. We were not made for endless light. We were made for the rhythm of flame and shadow, for the pause that darkness allows, for the small, glowing silence that once held the whole world together. And perhaps one day we'll learn again that sometimes, to see clearly, we must let the light go out. When you picture a medieval castle, you might imagine cold stone towers, echoing halls, and great feasts beneath banners and chandeliers. You might imagine the clatter of armor, the smell of roasting meat, the damp chill of the walls. But what most people forget, what even painters and poets politely ignore, is the other smell. Because of course, even knights and nobles needed to answer nature's call. And in the medieval world, that simple universal act was far from simple. It was an engineering challenge, a matter of hygiene, privacy, and dignity, or the lack of all three. So let's go there quietly and carefully, to the castle latrine, the garderobe, the medieval toilet, a word born from necessity. The term garderobe sounds elegant, doesn't it? It comes from the French words garde to garde and robe, clothing. Originally, it referred not to a toilet, but to a place where one kept clothes and valuables safe, often near warmth, sometimes even near, well, waste. You see, medieval people noticed something peculiar. The fumes from the privy, unpleasant though they were, tended to keep moths away. So a noble's cloak might hang in a small chamber adjoining the toilet, absorbing that peculiar protection. Over time, the word garderobe came to describe both spaces, the wardrobe and the latrine, an architectural blur born of practicality. Where the waste went, inside the stone walls of castles, engineers faced a constant problem: how to dispose of human waste without poisoning the inhabitants. The solution was simple, if inelegant: gravity. Most castle toilets were built as small protruding rooms high above the ground, often directly over the outer walls, or a moat. A hole in the stone or wooden seat allowed waste to drop straight down through a vertical shaft, called a chute, into a pit or the open air below. If the castle sat above a river, the waste might fall directly into the water. If not, it accumulated in cesspits, large, foul-smelling holes that servants would eventually have to empty by hand. Yes, by hand. These workers, known as gong farmers in later centuries, were paid well but lived miserably, shunned for their necessary trade. They worked at night, carrying buckets of filth away from the walls to dump in the fields beyond. No one wanted to be a gong farmer, but someone had to be. The architecture of modesty, the medieval toilet was often little more than a narrow chamber built into the castle wall, just large enough for one person to sit. A simple wooden seat with a round opening was set over a vertical shaft. Some were lined with stone, others with wood. If the castle was wealthy, the chamber might have a small window for ventilation, a luxury in itself. There was no running water, no flush, no privacy as we understand it. And yet, the placement of these small rooms reveals much about medieval life. You can still see them in the ruins of old castles' narrow projections sticking out from upper floors, their underside open to the air. Architects call them garderobe turrets. From outside, they look almost decorative, little stone boxes hanging precariously from the wall. But they were vital to daily comfort, and a constant reminder that even kings could not escape biology. Hygiene and the myth of filth. It's easy to think of the Middle Ages as a time of dirt and disease, and to some extent it was. But medieval people were not ignorant of hygiene, they simply understood it differently. They washed their hands before eating, bathed when possible, and used cloth or straw for wiping. In monasteries, stone channels carried water into communal latrines where monks sat side by side in quiet contemplation. Cleanliness was associated with spiritual discipline. But in castles, where defense took priority over comfort, the toilet was secondary. Water for flushing or cleaning had to be carried by hand, and the design of garderobes focused more on removing waste from the castle than on what happened afterward. Even so, some noble households experimented with rudimentary plumbing. At Kenilworth Castle in England, for instance, waste channels were lined with stone and occasionally flushed with rainwater diverted from gutters. At other sites, pipes carried the waste from multiple garderobes into a shared chute, a medieval forerunner of the sewer. They were crude, but they worked. The scent of status smell defined social rank more than one might imagine. Lower-class homes, lacking any sort of latrine, relied on chamber pots, simple containers emptied into the street or backyard. In crowded towns, the air itself was thick with the evidence of humanity. But in castles, where the elite lived above it all, literally, smell became a boundary between classes. The higher your toilet was, the better your status. Privies built high in towers were not just architectural conveniences, they were symbols of superiority. Waste fell far below, out of sight and out of mind. Servants handled what remained. The nobility, quite literally, rose above the stench of the world. Even the words we use today echo this distance. Upper class, lower class. Perhaps not entirely coincidental. Night, soil, and necessity. Imagine now a moonlit night in a medieval keep. The great hall quiet, the torches burning low. Somewhere a servant steps carefully through the corridors, carrying a bucket. This was the night soil collector's work. Discreet, unpleasant, necessary. In households without exterior garderobes, chamber pots filled during the night had to be emptied by morning. The contents went to a midden pit or compost heap, and in some cases were spread on fields as fertilizer. It was a cycle as old as agriculture itself, the waste of life returning to feed new life. Crude, but sustainable in its own way. Royal relief, even kings and queens had to manage their bodily needs with remarkable practicality. Edward I's castle at Harlech included a garderobe tower with a private chute leading down to the sea, an early example of royal plumbing. In Windsor Castle, multiple garderobes served each floor, carefully arranged so the smell would be drawn outward by prevailing winds. Still, no one was immune to mishaps. One chronicler records that in 1183, Henry I's son Geoffrey met a rather unfortunate end after falling into a latrine during a struggle at Paris. The cause of death, drowning in filth. Perhaps that, too, was a form of poetic justice. The Middle Ages had a dark sense of irony. The sounds of a castle at night. It's strange to think of how alive those stone walls were after dark. Behind every tapestry and arrow slit, people moved. Servants, guards, cooks, and yes, those carrying away waste. The garderobes, too, were in constant use, their chutes whispering faintly with every draught of air. Smell, sound, and dampness shaped the sensory world of the medieval castle. It was not the sterile grandeur we often imagine. It was living, breathing, sweating, and yes, flushing in its own primitive way. A curious symbol of civilization in modern times. We measure progress by technology, art, or literacy. But one might argue that the toilet, or rather its evolution, is a far truer sign of civilization. For the medieval world, waste management was not merely a matter of comfort. It was a question of survival. Improper disposal bred disease, weakened garrisons, and turned strongholds into breeding grounds for plague. Behind every glorious siege and gallant knightly tale lay the unglamorous labor of keeping the castle habitable. Without it, even the mightiest fortress would rot from within. And so, the humble garderobe stands as one of the great unsung inventions of the Middle Ages. A small, dark chamber that kept kingdoms running. A reminder that history, for all its grandeur, was built not just on battlefields and thrones, but on the simple act of staying clean enough to endure. Yet, as with all things medieval, the story does not end with the castle wall. For when the world began to change, when cities grew, populations swelled, and moats turned foul, the question of waste returned, larger and smellier than ever. How did medieval society move from these isolated guardrobes to the vast, subterranean sewers of the early modern age? What inventions bridged that long, odorous gap? That is where our story will flow next. If the medieval castle represented isolation, a self-contained world high above the filth, the medieval city was its opposite. It was humanity concentrated, noisy, cramped, bustling, alive. And with that closeness came a problem no army could defend against. Waste. Human, animal, industrial. It filled the streets, soaked the ground, and shaped the daily rhythm of survival. Before the age of sewers and sanitation, medieval cities were not just centers of trade and faith. They were living organisms struggling to digest their own refuse. Every cobblestone and gutter tells the story of that uneasy coexistence between life and what life leaves behind. The streets that flowed, imagine walking through 14th century London, Paris, or Prague. The narrow lanes are slick with rain and mud, the air thick with the mingled scents of smoke, bread, tallow, and manure. You step carefully, not because of traffic, but because the gutters on either side of the street run with filth. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows, often with a shout of warning, "Garde l'eau," derived from the French garde as l'eau. Watch out for the water. Those unlucky enough to pass beneath without heed might find themselves splashed by something far less pure than rain. It was the hazard of city life, constant, communal, unavoidable. The streets of London had open drains called kennels, shallow trenches that carried waste toward the Thames. But the river itself was no better. By the 14th century, it had become the city's ultimate receptacle, and, paradoxically, its main source of water. The same water drawn for brewing ale and washing clothes often mingled with the waste of thousands. The smell, one chronicler wrote, did rise like a pestilence. The privy and the pit. Despite this filth, most city homes had some form of latrine, usually a simple pit dug behind or beneath the building. These cesspits could be lined with brick or stone, sometimes shared between several households. When the pit filled, it had to be emptied, and so arose one of the strangest and least celebrated professions of the medieval world, the night soil man, or gong farmer. By law, these workers could only operate after dark, for obvious reasons. Armed with buckets, shovels, and long-handled scoops, they descended into the pits and scraped out the contents, carting it away through sleeping streets. The work was so foul that gong farmers were required to live on the outskirts of town, far from polite society. Yet, ironically, their trade was vital. Without them, entire districts would have drowned in their own waste. Their collected product was often sold to farmers as fertilizer, a grim but practical recycling system that sustained both city and countryside. The smell of prosperity, the richer the city grew, the worse it smelled. Markets overflowed with butchered meat and fish guts, tanneries soaked hides in urine, and breweries dumped spent grain into the drains. In Paris, regulations dating from the 1200s required tradesmen to keep waste away from public wells, but enforcement was rare. As populations rose, cesspits leaked into the groundwater, and disease became a familiar companion. Typhoid, dysentery, and the plague all found easy homes in the crowded, unsanitary quarters of medieval towns. Still, people adapted. They carried scented herbs or pressed oranges stuffed with cloves against their noses. Wealthy households burned incense or perfumed candles. Even the clergy, who preached cleanliness of the soul, were forced to accept that the body and the city had limits. Smell was inescapable. It defined medieval urban life the way electricity defines ours. The church and cleanliness in many medieval cities, monasteries were among the cleanest places of all. Their design followed the logic of order and routine. Separate dormitories, kitchens, and a room called the reredota, the communal latrine. Unlike most city dwellers, monks enjoyed primitive sanitation systems. Channels of running water, diverted from nearby streams, flushed through their latrines several times a day. Stone seats lined up along long benches allowed brothers to sit in silence, perhaps meditating on humility as water murmured below. Cistercian monasteries in particular were known for their hydraulic engineering, not for glamour, but for discipline. Cleanliness was a form of devotion, and managing waste was part of managing sin. The irony was that outside their walls the world still stank. Early attempts at regulation by the late Middle Ages, the growing density of European cities forced local authorities to act. In London, a 1357 proclamation forbade citizens from throwing filth, garbage, entrails, or dung into the Thames or the streets. Violators faced fines, though in truth enforcement depended on who was watching. Some towns built stone-lined sewers beneath major roads. Paris, for example, began constructing covered drains in the 14th century, though most remained open ditches until the 1700s. In Prague, archaeologists have uncovered early wooden sewer pipes, hollowed logs fitted end to end, carrying waste toward the Vltava River. These systems were crude but revolutionary. They showed a dawning understanding that waste, if left unchecked, could poison not just the body, but the entire fabric of urban life. Moats, rivers, and misunderstanding back in castles. Moats were sometimes mistaken for waste disposal systems. In truth, most moats were defensive and stagnant, poor places for dumping filth, though that didn't stop people from doing it. A moat could become a reeking, disease-ridden swamp within months if used as a sewer. And yet, the misconception persisted. In towns with fortifications, drains often emptied into the moat, creating an illusion of sanitation while merely shifting the problem outside the walls. The water looked distant, but the smell came right back on the wind. Even royal residences were not immune. At the Louvre, before it became a museum, waste from the king's apartments was funneled into pits near the moat, where it festered under the Paris sun. Visitors complained, but what could be done? The science of waste management had not yet caught up with the scale of civilization. Water as the new miracle. As the late Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, attitudes toward water began to shift. Clean water was no longer seen as a luxury, but as essential to public health. Though the connection between waste and disease was still poorly understood, people believed in miasma, the idea that foul odors themselves carried sickness, and in a strange way they weren't entirely wrong. The smell of decay did accompany contamination, even if the cause lay deeper, invisible to the eye. Thus began the great push to hide the filth, not to eliminate it, not yet, but to move it out of sight. Sewer openings were covered, waste pits bricked over, and previes tucked behind stone walls. Urban cleanliness became a matter of appearance rather than substance. But appearances, as always, were powerful. A clean street suggested order, order suggested health. Even if beneath the cobbles the old rot still flowed. A network beneath the feet by the 15th century London, Paris, and parts of Venice had partial sewer systems, narrow tunnels built of brick, guiding waste downhill into rivers. They were often too small for a person to enter, but large enough to carry the runoff of an entire neighborhood. Maintenance was done by small men or boys, crawling through with candles, scraping the walls clean. The work was as dangerous as it was filthy. Gases from decomposing waste could suffocate or explode, and many laborers perished in the dark. Still, the sewers expanded layer by layer, century by century, the silent arteries of an urban body learning to cleanse itself. The illusion of progress for all these advances, the average city in 1500 still smelled much the same as in 1300. Cesspits leaked, gutters overflowed, only the rich had toilets that drained properly, and even those emptied into public watercourses. And so the cycle continued: waste into the river, water from the river, sickness from the water. The people endured as they always had. What they lacked was not intelligence, but understanding, the invisible knowledge of bacteria, contagion, and filtration. That would come much later, in the 19th century, when science finally gave sanitation its foundation. Until then, the medieval city was a fragile balance between necessity and endurance, a civilization that lived, quite literally, atop its own refuse. Yet, for all its squalor, there was resilience in this system. The gong farmers, the drain builders, the monks tending their rarer daughters, all played their quiet roles in keeping the world livable. They were the invisible heroes of an age that prized knights and kings, but survived on humble labor. And in their hands, gloved or not, lay the beginnings of a revolution that would one day cleanse the world, the birth of the modern sewer. But before that dawn, there was one final chapter in the medieval struggle against waste, a curious blend of invention, superstition, and stubborn human pride. For even as cities expanded and smells grew unbearable, people clung to old ways, the chamber pot, the perfumed sachet, the candle in the window, believing that if one could not escape filth, one might at least make it smell a little better. How, then, did the medieval world finally begin to evolve into something cleaner? What inventions and ideas carried sanitation from superstition to science? That is where we'll turn next. For most of human history, the management of waste was less a science than a surrender, an endless cycle of concealment and endurance. Waste appeared, waste was buried, and the smell of living never quite faded. But as Europe emerged from the medieval period into the slow brightening of the Renaissance and beyond, something began to change. The problem of filth, once accepted as a fact of existence, became a mark of progress to overcome. It was not a single discovery nor a single man who changed it, but an accumulation of small realizations, each as quiet and unglamorous as the work it described. It is, perhaps, the most boring revolution in human history, and yet without it, no city could stand. The birth of clean thought in the 16th century, the idea of cleanliness, began to shift from spiritual to physical. The church had long emphasized the purity of the soul over that of the body, but as trade expanded and science crept forward, Europeans began to notice patterns, that certain illnesses struck the poor, that certain waters caused fever, that filth, though tolerated, carried invisible consequences. Doctors of the Renaissance still spoke of humus and vapors, but they observed, often correctly, that foul air followed decay. The theory of miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad smells, took hold. It was a misconception, but a useful one. For even though the cause was wrong, the response, cleaning streets, improving drainage, moving waste away from homes, laid the groundwork for true sanitation centuries later. Cities began to legislate cleanliness not for comfort but for health, and that, quietly, was a turning point. The privy evolves by the 1500s and 1600s. Wealthier homes began experimenting with more elaborate privies. Some houses in Tudor England had brick-lined cesspits beneath them, sealed at the top and emptied through small hatches at the side. The better designs used clay or lime to prevent leakage, a primitive but effective containment system. Water closets, in the modern sense, were still centuries away, but the principle of containment, separating waste from daily life, had taken root. In great estates, the garderobe became an indoor convenience, built close to outer walls or towers with gravity chutes. In cities, shared privies multiplied, often one per street, though cleanliness varied wildly. It was, by any measure, a messy compromise between necessity and aspiration. The first flushing idea then came, an idea so simple, so obvious in hindsight, that it seems astonishing it took humanity millennia to perfect water could carry waste away. The first known mechanical flushing toilet was invented in 1596 by Sir John Harrington, godson of Queen Elizabeth I. He called it the Jacks, a pun on Jakes, the slang word for toilet. His design included a water cistern that released a flush into a bowl, washing waste into a cesspit below. It was ingenious and expensive. The Queen herself had one installed at Richmond Palace, though it was not widely adopted. Why? Because cities still lacked sewers. A flushing toilet without a drainage system merely moved the problem a few feet further. Harrington's device was a century too early, a brilliant invention waiting for the infrastructure to catch up. The stagnant centuries, for the next 200 years, not much changed. People continued to rely on chamber pots, cesspits, and night soil collectors. Sewers remained open ditches or narrow drains, carrying a slow river of decay beneath the cobbles. In 17th century London, the night soil trade was still thriving. Farmers purchased waste by the cartload to fertilize their fields. It was, in a sense, an economy of excrement, unpleasant but essential. Even as cities grew to tens and hundreds of thousands, the waste system remained medieval in spirit, local, manual, temporary. The air was cleaner only where the wind blew hardest. The smell that changed everything then. In the summer of 1858, London finally reached its limit. The heat that year was relentless. The River Thames, choked with centuries of refuse, raw sewage and runoff, began to ferment in the sun. The stench was so overwhelming that it paralyzed Parliament itself. Curtains soaked in lime and vinegar could not block it. Newspapers called it the Great Stink. It was the culmination of everything the Middle Ages had failed to solve: population, waste, water, and denial. And yet, it became the moment of reckoning, because in that smell, politicians found urgency. And in urgency, the modern sewer was born. The engineer of clean, the man who answered that call, was Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer of remarkable patience and vision. His plan, approved in 1859, was not just to build sewers, but to redesign how a city breathed. He proposed an underground system of massive brick tunnels running parallel to the Thames, collecting waste from thousands of smaller drains and carrying it eastward, away from the city. It was the largest public works project of its time. More than 300 miles of sewers beneath the streets of London. When completed, it transformed the capital. The Thames ran cleaner, the air sweetened, and diseases like cholera began to decline. It was a victory so thorough that most people never thought of it again. Bazalgette himself, modest and wary, once remarked that if the system worked as planned, "No one will ever know my name." He was right, but the world he helped clean owes him every breath. Science finally catches up around the same time. A revolution of a different sort was taking place in laboratories. In the 1860s and 1870s, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch demonstrated that disease was not carried by bad smells, but by microorganisms, invisible life that thrived in filth and water alike. This discovery, germ theory, confirmed what centuries of intuition had hinted at: cleanliness was not moral, but biological. To be healthy was to control the unseen. With that, the entire philosophy of sanitation changed. Waste was no longer just a nuisance, it was a threat to public life. Sewers, toilets, and clean water became the foundation of modern civilization. It had taken humanity thousands of years to understand what the medieval gong farmers had known by instinct: that health begins where filth ends. From garderobe to flush, by the early 20th century, nearly every major city in Europe and America had underground sewer networks. Flush toilets became standard fixtures. The old garderobes and cesspits disappeared, sealed beneath layers of progress. And yet, if you walk through the ruins of medieval castles, you can still see their stone chutes, leading downward into the open air. They are, in their own quiet way, the ancestors of every porcelain bowl and steel pipe today. Each one represents an early, awkward attempt at something noble: the desire to separate human dignity from human necessity. From holes in the wall to hydraulic marvels, the story of the toilet is the story of civilization learning to face what it most wished to ignore. A civilization of water today. The average person flushes away waste with the push of a button, never considering where it goes. It disappears, out of sight, out of mind, into the arteries of a hidden world. Modern sanitation systems are among humanity's greatest unseen achievements. They preserve cities, prevent disease, and sustain billions. But they also isolate us from the fragile balance our ancestors knew: the cycle of soil and waste, of labor and humility. The medieval peasant who carried night soil to the fields might not have lived long, but he understood the connection between life and what nourishes it. We, surrounded by convenience, have forgotten that lesson. What the Middle Ages left behind. And so, when we speak of medieval filth, it is tempting to mock it, to laugh at the crude privies and the foul-smelling streets. But perhaps we should instead admire their endurance. They survived without plumbing, without germ theory, without disinfectant. They endured because they accepted filth as part of life and adapted as best they could. The medieval world did not conquer its waste. It lived with it. We, in our modern cities of light and porcelain, have merely hidden ours underground. And perhaps that is the true continuity of history. The problem never disappears. It only moves. The quiet lesson: if one stands today beside the moss-covered remains of a castle garderobe, the air cool and still, the wind sighing through the shaft, it is easy to forget what it once carried. But that empty chute, that hole in the wall, is a monument, not to filth, but to progress. To the countless, nameless laborers who shoveled, cleaned, drained, and built. It was they who made cities livable. It was they who turned waste into wisdom. And as you listen to the faint drip of water echoing in a modern drain, perhaps you are hearing their legacy. A reminder that civilization, for all its grandeur, rests on something profoundly humble. For in the end, history is not just the story of kings and conquests. It is the story of pipes and pits and people who refuse to live in their own waste. It is the story of how humanity learned, one bucket at a time, to clean itself, and in doing so to survive. Before the world began to tick, time flowed like a river, steady, unknowable, and free of precision. For most of human history, people lived not by hours, but by rhythms. The crowing of roosters, the rising of stars, the calling of bells. These were the boundaries of life. A farmer did not need to know it was 6:15 a.m. He rose when dawn lit the field. A monk did not need to see a clock. He prayed when the shadows fell to the right length on the cloister wall. Time was not divided, but felt. It would take centuries, and the stubborn tinkering of countless craftsmen, for that flowing sense of time to become mechanical, for the natural pulse of the world to be measured, divided, and controlled. And when it did, humanity itself changed. The shape of time before machines. In early medieval Europe, most people could not have told you what time meant beyond sunrise, noon, and dusk. Villagers used the position of the sun to judge the day. Merchants might carry small sundials, no larger than a palm, to orient themselves while traveling. The wealthy occasionally owned elaborate astrolabes or clepsydrae, water clocks. But these were less about telling time and more about demonstrating knowledge. It was not precision that mattered, it was order. Time was a social arrangement, not a scientific one. The baker promised to deliver bread before the first bell. The blacksmith said the horseshoes would be ready by vespers. No one needed minutes or seconds. They needed only enough measure to live in harmony with the day. Monks and the discipline of hours, the earliest Europeans to truly care about the division of time, were not merchants or kings, but monks. In monasteries from Ireland to Italy, life revolved around prayer. The canonical hours, fixed points throughout the day when chants and rituals were performed. Matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime at the first hour, terce sext none, and vespers at sunset. To keep these hours required more than faith. It required regularity. But as any medieval monk could tell you, the sun is a fickle clock. Its position changes with the seasons. Days stretch and contract, and so, in abbeys and priories, the first true experiments with timekeeping began. They built water clocks, bowls that filled and emptied at a predictable rate, to measure the hours of prayer when the sky gave no clue. The ticking of time, though still silent, had begun. The clepsydra and the candle water clocks, or clepsydrae, had ancient origins. The Egyptians and Greeks used them to time speeches or rituals thousands of years earlier. But in medieval Europe, they were reborn in a different spirit, not as instruments of science, but of devotion. Monks would watch as water dripped from one vessel into another, counting the rise of a float or the mark of a scale. Some even added small bells that rang when a vessel emptied, calling the brothers to prayer. In places where water was impractical, candle clocks offered an alternative. Candles of uniform thickness were marked with lines. As the wax melted to each mark, an hour passed. Sometimes tiny metal balls were embedded in the wax so they would fall onto a metal plate with a soft chime as the candle burned down. A delicate, smoky measure of time's passage. These were humble machines, yet in them, humanity had begun to tame time, to make the invisible flow of hours tangible. The dawn of mechanical thought, the transition from water and fire to gears and levers was not sudden. It grew out of medieval Europe's fascination with motion and measurement. In the 13th century, scholars like Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon began to imagine devices that could measure time through mechanical motion rather than natural decay. They studied the relationship between weight, motion, and resistance, the seeds of mechanical philosophy. By the late 1200s, the first mechanical clocks appeared in Europe. Their origins are obscure, no single inventor can claim them. They emerged almost mysteriously from the workshops of blacksmiths and cathedral builders whose craft combined metal, geometry, and patience. Unlike water or candles, these machines did not rely on nature. They ran on power, gravity pulling a weight, regulated by a mechanism that released it in steady intervals. The world's first mechanical hearts began to beat. The sound of time imagined standing in a European town around the year 1320. The market is quiet, the smell of iron and straw hangs in the air. Then, from the tower of a church, a deep sound rolls through the streets. Silayang Silayang Enjing. It is the voice of a new age, the first public clock bells. They were rough, inaccurate things, often hours off within days, but they changed everything. For the first time, time belonged to the town. People began to gather their work, their trade, and their prayer around a common rhythm. Merchants agreed to meet at the third bell. Markets opened and closed on schedule. Even sleep began to conform to the ring of metal echoing through stone. It was not just a technological revolution, it was a social one. The craft of the clockmaker, the new craft of clockmaking, emerged as one of the most mysterious trades of the late Middle Ages. It demanded not only knowledge of metal and mechanics, but an intuitive grasp of patience. Each gear had to be cut by hand, each tooth filed to perfection. A single misalignment could ruin the motion entirely. Clockmakers were part smith, part philosopher, part mathematician. They worked by candlelight, surrounded by the scent of oil and brass. Their tools were hammers, chisels, files, and the soft whisper of breath held steady. They made something humanity had never truly possessed before: consistency. The earliest clocks were enormous, often installed in church towers, driven by heavy stones or lead weights. There were no dials or hands at first, only bells. The sound of time was enough. The theology of time. It is difficult for the modern mind to grasp how spiritual time once was. In the medieval worldview, time was a gift of God, a measure of life given to humanity in fixed length. To waste time was to sin. To mark it was to honor the divine order. Clocks, then, were more than machines. They were sacred instruments. Each tick, each swing of a verge and foliot, the earliest mechanical regulator, was a small imitation of the heavens, a reflection of divine regularity. To many, the clock was not a device to measure time, but to praise it, to echo the eternal precision of God's creation. Thus, it is no surprise that the earliest clocks were built for cathedrals and monasteries, not for homes. Time itself, in the beginning, belonged to the church. The The public clock revolution. By the 14th century, mechanical clocks spread across Europe. Cities like Milan, Padua and Strasbourg competed to build ever more complex clock towers. These clocks displayed not only the hour, but also the phases of the moon, the zodiac, and the calendar of saints. To watch one of these early machines in motion, with its gears of bronze, its wooden drums, its slow pendulous rhythm, was to glimpse the very structure of order. People would gather in the square to see the figures move. Tiny angels striking bells, kings bowing on the hour, celestial spheres rotating above. Time had become a spectacle, but it also brought a new kind of anxiety. For the first time, one could be late. The march toward precision. As towns grew and trade intensified, precision became a virtue. Merchants, travelers, and workers began to depend on clocks for coordination. In the 15th century, the addition of clock faces with hands allowed individuals to see time, not just hear it. The clock face itself, a circle divided into 12 parts, became one of the most recognizable symbols of order. Its motion was continuous, predictable, and universal. It represented not just time, but civilization. Still, these early clocks were crude. A day's drift of 10 or 15 minutes was common. To adjust them, town clerks would compare the clock to sundials or the position of the sun. In some places, they relied on roosters, whose crowing remained the most reliable morning alarm. And yet, every tick of every uneven clock was a step toward a world ruled by precision. The human clock. The more humanity measured time, the more time began to measure humanity. Where once people rose with the sun, now they rose with the bell. Where once work ended with dusk, now it ended with the hour. Monks had sought to structure prayer, merchants now structured profit. The abstraction of time had entered daily life. Every sound of the clock's hammer on bronze carried with it a quiet message: time is no longer yours. It must be kept, counted, obeyed. The medieval world, built on cycles and seasons, was giving way to something new. A world of motion, of counting, of ticking. The mechanical heart of civilization was beginning to beat faster. As you imagine the candlelit tower of a 14th century town, gears turning slowly in the darkness, and a monk listening for the next chime through the echo of stone corridors, consider this: what happened when humans finally learned to master time, and discovered that time, in turn, began to master them. The medieval world had built its first great clocks, vast contraptions of gears, chains, and bells. They marked the hours for towns and cathedrals, binding communities to rhythm. But by the dawn of the Renaissance, the ambition of man began to shrink the cosmos into metal. The age of the individual clockmaker had arrived. From silent monasteries to noisy city workshops, artisans began building devices not for towers, but for tables, rooms, and pockets. The mastery of time was no longer confined to the divine. It was becoming personal. From towers to tables in the early 15th century, the same technology that drove cathedral clocks began to find smaller forms. Blacksmiths and engineers, curious and competitive, realized that gears could be made lighter, springs could replace falling weights, and balance could regulate motion without gravity. The key innovation was the mainspring, a tightly wound strip of metal that stored energy when wound and released it slowly as it unwound. Unlike weights, which required vertical towers and pulleys, mainsprings allowed timepieces to be portable. The first spring-driven clocks appeared in Europe around the 1430s. They were not accurate by modern standards, often losing an hour a day, but they represented a revolution in scale. A world that once measured time with bells in towers could now do so on a desk. The birth of the Clockmakers Guild. As the demand for smaller clocks grew, so did the reputation of those who made them. Cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Florence became centers of horological craftsmanship. Clockmakers formed guilds, strict brotherhoods that guarded their techniques and secrets. To become a master required years of apprenticeship, filing, fitting, and forging hundreds of pieces with precision beyond the reach of most artisans. The guilds not only protected their craft, they elevated it. A well-made clock was now a work of art, an emblem of intellect and wealth. Kings collected them, scholars admired them, merchants displayed them as proof of sophistication. To own a clock was to command the rarest luxury of all, control over time itself. The master from Nuremberg, among the earliest and most famous of these masters, was Peter Henlein, a locksmith from Nuremberg in the early 1500s. He is often credited, though perhaps too generously, with creating the first portable watch. Henlein's creations, known as Nuremberg eggs, were small drum-shaped timepieces driven by mainsprings and balance wheels. They were worn on belts or carried in pouches, too large for the wrist but small enough to move with their owners. Though they lacked minute hands and ran only a few hours on